The morning air over Tokyo Bay felt strangely calm. The sea barely moved. A thin layer of cloud covered the sky, softening the sunlight as if nature itself wanted to quiet the final moments of the deadliest war in history. Hundreds of American sailors stood shoulder to shoulder along the rails of the battleship USS Missouri. Officers from nearly every major Allied nation waited in complete silence. Cameras were ready. Pens had been placed on a simple table covered with green felt. Every eye watched the horizon. Somewhere out there, a small Japanese launch was moving closer. On board were the men who had once commanded an empire stretching across Asia and the Pacific. In just a few minutes, they would step onto the deck of an American battleship to surrender. But no one knew exactly how they would behave. Would they show regret? Would they remain proud until the very end? Or would one small act threaten to shatter the fragile peace before the ink even touched the paper? Almost every person standing on the deck understood the weight of the moment. Less than 4 years earlier, Japan had launched its surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. Since then, millions of soldiers and civilians had died across thousands of miles of ocean. Entire cities had disappeared beneath bombing raids. Islands with names few people had known before the war had become symbols of unimaginable sacrifice. The Pacific War had changed the lives of everyone present. Some had lost brothers. Others had lost lifelong friends. Many still carried wounds hidden beneath their uniforms. Yet on this quiet September morning, revenge was not supposed to take center stage. History itself was waiting. To understand why this ceremony became one of the most important moments of the 20th century, you have to follow two different journeys. They began on opposite sides of the war. They crossed battlefields, oceans, and years of suffering. And they would finally meet on the deck of USS Missouri on September 2, 1945. The first journey belonged to General of the Army Douglas MacArthur. Tall, confident, and instantly recognizable with his open collar shirt, sunglasses, and corncob pipe. MacArthur had become one of America's most famous military leaders. But only 3 years earlier, his reputation had been hanging by a thread. In early 1942, after Japan swept across the Pacific, American and Filipino forces found themselves trapped on the Bataan Peninsula and the island fortress of Corregidor in the Philippines. Supplies disappeared. Disease spread. Every day the Japanese tightened their grip. President Franklin D. Roosevelt made a difficult decision. MacArthur was ordered to leave the Philippines before he could be captured. On the night of March 11, 1942, under complete darkness, he escaped aboard PT boats before flying to Australia. It was one of the hardest moments of his career. He knew thousands of his soldiers would remain behind to face capture. Before reaching Australia, he made the promise that would define the next years of his life. He declared, "I shall return." Those words became more than a statement. They became a mission. Across America, newspapers printed them. Soldiers repeated them. The people of the occupied Philippines held on to them. MacArthur understood something many commanders never fully grasped. Victory was not only about defeating an enemy, it was also about giving people hope when almost everything else had disappeared. While MacArthur rebuilt Allied strength in the Southwest Pacific, another journey was unfolding inside Japan. Among the men who would eventually board USS Missouri was Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu. Unlike many military leaders, Shigemitsu had spent years working as a diplomat. In 1932, during a ceremony in Shanghai, he survived an assassination attempt when a Korean nationalist threw a bomb near Japanese officials. The explosion severely injured his right leg, forcing him to use a cane for the rest of his life. That limp would become one of the most recognizable images on the surrender day. Shigemitsu believed diplomacy could often achieve what endless fighting could not. But throughout much of the war, the Japanese military held enormous influence over government decisions. Civilian voices like his often struggled to shape national policy. As Japan's battlefield situation worsened, however, reality slowly became impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, MacArthur's campaign gathered momentum. Allied forces fought through New Guinea using a strategy that became known as island hopping. Instead of attacking every Japanese stronghold, MacArthur and Admiral Chester W. Nimitz bypassed many heavily defended positions, cutting them off from supplies while advancing toward Japan. Every successful landing pushed Allied forces closer to the Japanese homeland. By October 1944, MacArthur finally returned to the Philippines. Standing in shallow water after landing on Leyte Island, he fulfilled the promise he had made more than 2 years earlier. Around the world, photographs captured the moment. But even then, he knew the war was far from over. Some of the bloodiest battles in the Pacific still lay ahead. Inside Japan, military leaders remained divided. Some believed they could still force the Allies into negotiating favorable peace terms. Others understood that Japan's position was becoming hopeless. Cities burned under constant bombing. Industrial production collapsed. Fuel shortages crippled the Navy and Air Force. Merchant ships vanished beneath American submarines. Food became increasingly scarce. Then came August 6, 1945, at 8:15 in the morning, an American B-29 bomber named Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb over Hiroshima. In seconds, much of the city disappeared beneath an explosion unlike anything humanity had ever witnessed. Tens of thousands died immediately. Thousands more would later die from burns and radiation. Only 3 days later, on August 9th, a second atomic bomb struck Nagasaki. That same day, the Soviet Union launched a massive invasion of Japanese forces in Manchuria after declaring war on Japan. The combination of these events shocked Japan's highest leaders. Even those who had argued for continuing the fight now faced impossible military realities. At the center of every discussion stood Emperor Hirohito. For years, many Japanese citizens had viewed him as almost beyond ordinary politics. Now, he faced the greatest decision of his reign. During an imperial conference on August 14, after senior leaders remained deadlocked over whether to surrender, Hirohito personally intervened. He announced that Japan must accept the Allied terms contained in the Potsdam Declaration. The decision stunned many military officers. Some accepted it with sorrow. Others simply could not believe the war was ending this way. During the night of August 14 and early August 15, a group of officers attempted what later became known as the Kij Incident. They hoped to prevent the emperor's recorded surrender message from reaching the Japanese people. If they succeeded, they believed the war might continue. The plan failed. By noon on August 15, millions of Japanese citizens gathered around radios to hear their emperor's voice for the first time. His language remained formal and indirect, but the meaning became clear. Japan had accepted surrender. For soldiers scattered across Asia and the Pacific, confusion followed. Some obeyed immediately. Others refused to believe the announcement was genuine. In isolated jungles and remote islands, fighting continued for days and sometimes weeks because communication had broken down or commanders rejected the news. MacArthur now faced an entirely different challenge. Winning battles required one set of skills. Ending a global war required another. As Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, he would oversee not only Japan's surrender, but also the occupation that followed. Every decision he made during these first days could influence millions of lives. Preparations began almost immediately. Tokyo Bay was selected for the formal ceremony. The location carried deep symbolism. American warships now anchored peacefully where Japanese naval power had once dominated nearby waters. The battleship chosen to host the ceremony also held symbolic value. USS Missouri carried the name of President Harry S. Truman's home state. It was one of the newest and most powerful battleships ever built. On September 1, Allied ships filled the bay. Aircraft circled overhead. Security remained intense. Although Japan had accepted surrender, nobody completely dismissed the possibility of desperate attacks by isolated extremists. Thousands of sailors quietly watched every movement across the water. At the same time, inside Tokyo, the Japanese delegation prepared for what many considered the most painful duty of their lives. Mamoru Shigemitsu dressed carefully in formal mourning clothes rather than military uniform. He would sign on behalf of the Japanese government. Beside him would stand General Yoshijiro Umezu, Chief of the Army General Staff, representing Japan's Imperial Armed Forces. Both men understood cameras from around the world would record every step they took. The pressure upon them was enormous. They represented a defeated empire. Yet they also carried the responsibility of preventing further bloodshed. One wrong action, one emotional outburst, or one misunderstood gesture could damage the fragile peace taking shape. Before sunrise on September 2, the delegation boarded a launch that slowly carried them toward USS Missouri. American sailors watched from above as the small vessel approached the massive battleship. The contrast could not have been greater. The towering steel walls of the American ship seemed to symbolize the complete reversal of fortune since Pearl Harbor. As the launch came alongside, silence spread across the deck. Journalists adjusted their cameras. Officers straightened their uniforms. Allied representatives waited without speaking. The Japanese delegation climbed the ladder one careful step at a time. Shigemitsu leaned slightly on his cane because of the injury he had carried for more than a decade. Umezu followed close behind, his face showing almost no emotion. Then came one of the most closely watched walks in military history. Every movement mattered. Every expression would be studied for decades. Many Allied servicemen expected the Japanese officers to bow deeply as a sign of complete submission. Others believed they might refuse any gesture that appeared humiliating. The atmosphere became almost impossible to describe. You could almost feel the tension carried by every person standing on that deck. Years of hatred, sacrifice, grief, and determination had led to these few quiet moments. The Japanese delegation reached the surrender table. Across from them stood Douglas MacArthur. Two journeys that had begun on opposite sides of the Pacific had finally met. Neither side had spoken a single unnecessary word. And in the next few moments, one small decision about dignity, respect, and leadership would become one of the defining images of the end of World War II. The silence that settled over the deck of USS Missouri on the morning of September 2, 1945, seemed to last far longer than it actually did. In reality, only a few seconds passed. But for everyone standing there, those seconds carried the weight of an entire world war. Allied officers watched closely. Sailors lined the rails without moving. Journalists held their cameras ready, knowing that every photograph taken in the next few minutes would become part of history. Many stories have since claimed that Japanese officers stubbornly refused to bow before General Douglas MacArthur. Over the years, this dramatic version has spread through books, documentaries, and the internet. The truth is more complicated and, in many ways, even more powerful. The Japanese delegation arrived with solemn dignity. They were clearly defeated, but they also represented their nation at one of its darkest moments. MacArthur understood that humiliating them would achieve nothing. His goal that morning was not revenge. His goal was to end the war in a way that allowed peace to begin immediately. MacArthur stepped forward with complete confidence. He did not demand gestures of submission. He did not order anyone to kneel. He did not try to embarrass the defeated representatives before the cameras of the world. Instead, he maintained a calm military bearing that instantly set the tone for the ceremony. His composure quietly reminded everyone present that true victory did not require public humiliation. Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu approached the table first. Walking with the aid of his cane, he moved slowly but steadily. Every eye followed him. He removed his gloves, adjusted himself before the documents, and prepared to sign. General Yoshijiro Umezu stood nearby, waiting for his own turn. Neither man smiled. Neither displayed anger. Their expressions reflected exhaustion more than anything else. After nearly 8 years of war in Asia and almost 4 years of fighting against the United States and its allies, there was little energy left for pride. MacArthur then began the ceremony with a brief address. His words were measured and remarkably restrained. Rather than celebrating military triumph, he spoke about hope. He explained that the ceremony represented more than the ending of one conflict. It offered humanity an opportunity to build a better future. After years of destruction, he believed the world needed justice guided by wisdom instead of revenge guided by emotion. Those listening noticed something important. MacArthur never treated the Japanese representatives as if they were beneath him. They were defeated enemies, but they were still participants in a legal surrender between nations. That distinction mattered enormously. History had shown many examples of victors humiliating the defeated. Such moments often planted the seeds for future conflicts. MacArthur wanted something different. At approximately 9:04 in the morning, Shigemitsu leaned forward and signed the instrument of surrender on behalf of the Emperor of Japan and the Japanese government. Because of his injured leg, even this simple movement required care. When he finished, he stepped back. General Umezu then signed for the Imperial Japanese General Headquarters. The war that had consumed so much of the world was, on paper, finally over. MacArthur signed next as Supreme Commander for the Allied powers. He used several pens during the ceremony, later presenting some of them as historic gifts. One pen was given to Lieutenant General Jonathan Wainwright, who had endured years of captivity after the fall of Corregidor. Another was presented to Lieutenant General Arthur Percival, who had surrendered Singapore in 1942 and had also spent years as a prisoner of war. These quiet gestures connected the ceremony not only to victory, but also to those who had suffered through defeat before living long enough to witness its reversal. After MacArthur signed, representatives from each Allied nation came forward one by one. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz signed for the United States. General Xu Yungchang signed for China. Admiral Sir Bruce Fraser signed for the United Kingdom. Lieutenant General Kuzma Derevyanko signed for the Soviet Union. Representatives from Australia, Canada, France, the Netherlands, and New Zealand followed. Each signature represented another nation whose people had paid a terrible price during the war. The ceremony itself lasted only about 20 minutes. It was surprisingly short considering the years of fighting that had led to it. There were no dramatic speeches from the Japanese delegation. There were no emotional confrontations. There were no public arguments. The greatest military conflict in human history ended not with another battle, but with signatures placed carefully upon a few sheets of paper. Then came one of the day's most unforgettable moments. As the ceremony concluded, more than 400 American aircraft suddenly appeared overhead. Fighters, bombers, and carrier aircraft roared across Tokyo Bay in carefully organized formations. The flyover had been planned in advance, but to many watching below it felt like a final reminder of the overwhelming power that had brought Japan to surrender. The sound echoed across the water as ship crews looked upward. Yet even this impressive display did not overshadow the image that newspapers around the world carried the next day. Most front pages showed the simple surrender table. There were no extravagant decorations, no grand stage, just men in military uniforms, a green cloth, official documents, and a handful of pens. The simplicity made the moment even more memorable. Once the ceremony ended, the Japanese delegation quietly departed the battleship. They climbed back into their launch and returned toward shore. No one jeered at them. No one attempted to insult them. The dignity with which the ceremony had been conducted reflected the tone MacArthur intended to establish for the occupation that was about to begin. That occupation became one of the most remarkable chapters of modern history. As Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, MacArthur now faced responsibilities unlike those of almost any military commander before him. His mission was not simply to control a defeated nation. He needed to help rebuild it while preventing future aggression. During the months that followed, Japan underwent enormous change. The Imperial Japanese Army and Navy were dissolved. Millions of soldiers returned home from battlefields across Asia. Weapons were surrendered. Military industries shifted toward peaceful production. Democratic reforms began reshaping the country's political system. One of the most important developments came with the creation of a new constitution. Introduced during the occupation, it included Article 9, through which Japan renounced war as a sovereign right and pledged not to maintain armed forces for aggressive purposes. Although debates about its interpretation continue today, the document marked a dramatic break from the militarism that had driven Japan into conflict. MacArthur also encouraged land reform, improvements in education, expanded rights for women, and measures intended to strengthen democratic institutions. These changes were not always easy. Some Japanese citizens welcomed them. Others viewed them with uncertainty or resentment. But together they transformed post-war Japan more rapidly than many observers thought possible. Looking back, historians continue to debate countless decisions made during the occupation. Yet many agree that the tone established on the deck of USS Missouri helped shape everything that followed. Had the surrender become a spectacle of humiliation, bitterness might have grown even deeper. Instead, MacArthur chose discipline over emotion. The relationship between the United States and Japan slowly changed in the years after the war. Two nations that had once fought some of the fiercest battles in history gradually became close partners. That transformation did not happen overnight. It required years of rebuilding, diplomacy, and mutual effort. But the first step began on that September morning when the war officially ended without unnecessary revenge. Today, visitors who see the preserved USS Missouri in Pearl Harbor often stop beside the bronze plaque marking the exact location of the surrender table. Standing there, it is difficult not to imagine the silence that filled the deck. You can almost hear the distant sound of cameras clicking and the gentle movement of Tokyo Bay beneath the battleship. It is a reminder that some of history's greatest turning points happen not during explosions or battles, but during quiet decisions made by leaders who understand the future is more important than the past. The popular story that MacArthur faced stubborn Japanese officers who refused to bow captures people's imagination because it suggests a final confrontation between victor and defeated. But the historical reality offers a lesson that is even more meaningful. MacArthur's greatest act that morning was not forcing obedience. It was recognizing that lasting peace could never be built upon public humiliation. He understood that ending a war required more than military strength. It required restraint at the exact moment when victory made revenge possible. For the sailors watching from the rails, the ceremony marked the end of years spent crossing dangerous oceans. For former prisoners of war, it meant suffering had not been forgotten. For families waiting at home, it meant loved ones could finally begin returning. For Japan, it marked the beginning of an uncertain but hopeful future. And for the world, it closed one chapter while opening another. When the Japanese launch disappeared into the distance and the great battleship resumed its quiet watch over Tokyo Bay, there were no cheers loud enough to erase the memories of the war. Too many lives had been lost for celebration alone. But there was something stronger than celebration. There was relief. There was hope. There was the realization that humanity had survived one of its darkest chapters. In the end, history remembers Douglas MacArthur not because he forced defeated men to lower their heads, but because he understood that true leadership is measured by what a commander does after winning. On September 2, 1945, aboard USS Missouri, he accepted the surrender of an empire without turning the moment into an act of vengeance. That decision helped lay the foundation for one of the most remarkable post-war recoveries in modern history. The guns had finally fallen silent. The signatures were complete. The Second World War was over. But the choice to replace hatred with disciplined leadership ensured that the peace which followed would become every bit as important as the victory itself.